Imagine waking up on the morning of September 4th, 476 AD, and you are 16 years old. You are not a soldier, you are not a general, you barely shave yet. But the moment your eyes open, in the pale gray light of Ravenna, Italy, you already sense it. Something is deeply, irreversibly wrong. The palace is too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't mean peace. The kind of quiet that means everyone who is supposed to protect you has already decided not to. Your name is Romulus Augustulus, a name almost absurdly grand for a boy in oversized sandals. Romulus, like the mythological founder of Rome itself. Augustus, like the greatest emperor who ever lived. Two of the most colossal names in Western civilization, stitched together and handed to a teenager who never asked for any of this. It would be poetic if it weren't so brutal. You didn't earn this throne. Your father, Orestes, a former secretary to Attila the Hun, of all people, seized it for you 10 months ago by deposing the previous emperor at sword point. So here you are, the emperor of Rome. On paper, in theory, in the terrifying, increasingly thin sense that the word emperor still means anything at all. Outside your window, somewhere beyond the marshes that surround Ravenna, a Gothic chieftain named Odoacer is marching with an army of men who haven't been paid, haven't been respected, and haven't been given the land they were promised. They are done waiting, and they are coming for you specifically. You have 24 hours left as the ruler of the Roman Empire. What happens next is not just your story. It is the story of how an entire civilization collapses, not with a thunderclap, but with something far more unsettling, a quiet, exhausted shrug. To understand how a 16-year-old boy ends up as the last emperor of Rome, you have to understand that Rome had been dying for a very long time, and almost nobody wanted to admit it. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire was not the grand civilization you picture from school textbooks. Forget the marble forums, the triumphant legions, the confident senators in white togas making sweeping speeches about republic and virtue. That Rome had been gone for at least 2 centuries. What remained in 476 was something far more fragile, far more fractured, and far more dependent on the very people it considered barbarians to keep itself standing. Here is the brutal truth that the history books often soften. Rome didn't fall because it was invaded by outsiders. Rome fell because it had been outsourcing its own survival for generations. By the mid-5th century, the Roman legions, the famous, disciplined war machine that had conquered Gaul, Britain, North Africa, and the entire Mediterranean coast, were overwhelmingly staffed by Germanic soldiers. Goths, Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, Burgundians. Men who were Roman in uniform, but not in culture, not in loyalty, and increasingly, not in patience. The empire paid them in coin when it had coin. It promised them land when it had land, and when it ran out of both, it hoped the uniforms were enough to keep them in line. They were not enough. The man who would end Romulus Augustulus's reign, Odoacer, was himself a product of this system. His exact ethnic origin is debated by historians, possibly Syrian, possibly part Hunnic, definitely Germanic. But what's certain is that he was a soldier who had served Rome faithfully and had watched Rome repeatedly fail to honor its side of the arrangement. He had watched Roman aristocrats hoard wealth in fortified villas, while the soldiers who defended the roads, the bridges, and the borders went unpaid for months at a stretch. Meanwhile, the political situation in Ravenna, which had replaced Rome as the actual seat of Western imperial power decades earlier, because its marshes made it easier to defend, which tells you something about how confident the empire felt, was a revolving door of puppet emperors and power-hungry generals. Between 455 and 476 AD, the Western Empire cycled through no fewer than 8 emperors. Some historians count as many as 9, depending on whether you include every claimant who briefly seized the purple. Some lasted months, one lasted 11 days. The Senate confirmed them, the generals tolerated them briefly, and then eliminated them when convenient. Romulus Augustulus's father, Orestes, was the latest in a line of strongmen who thought they could use the imperial title as a rubber stamp. Orestes had made his career as a skilled administrator and power broker, including, notably, years spent working directly under Attila the Hun as his secretary and diplomatic agent, which required a particular kind of cold intelligence and a complete absence of squeamishness. He was not a man who lacked confidence. He was a man who had spent his career executing the will of whoever held the real power. And now, for the first time, he believed he was that person. The soldiers under Odoacer had made a specific, reasonable, documented demand: 1/3 of the Italian peninsula's land to be redistributed to the troops. In a functioning empire with functioning institutions, this might have been negotiated, delayed, partially granted. Orestes simply said no, not because he had a better alternative to offer, not because he had a military force strong enough to enforce his refusal. He said no because a man who had spent his entire career as the instrument of power, never its source, had finally seized the title and confused holding the title with actually holding the power. He thought being emperor was enough. It was not. Odoacer did not forget. He raised his soldiers in open revolt in August 476. The campaign was swift and merciless. Orestes was captured near the town of Piacenza on August 28th and executed on the spot. No trial, no dramatic last words recorded, no elaborate ceremony. Just the end of a man who had overestimated his own leverage. The army then moved on Ravenna, where his teenage son sat on a throne that was, at this point, purely decorative. And here is the thing that should make you stop and think. As Odoacer's forces closed in, there was no great rallying of loyal Roman troops, no last-ditch defense organized by senators determined to preserve the empire, no dramatic speech from the teenage emperor himself calling on the glory of Rome to rise one final time. The machinery of resistance simply didn't exist. The empire had hollowed itself out so thoroughly that when the moment of final reckoning arrived, there was almost nothing left to defend. Audience interaction 1. What do you think, was the fall of the Western Roman Empire inevitable, or were there moments where it could have been saved? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you all think, because historians have been arguing about this one for 15 centuries, and nobody agrees. Odoacer entered Ravenna on September 4th, 476 AD. The gates did not require battering, but what happened inside those gates when he finally came face to face with the boy emperor? That's where this story gets genuinely strange. Picture the city of Ravenna on that September morning, and understand that it does not look like the capital of a dying empire. It looks, in many ways, beautiful. Ravenna, in 476 AD, is a city of mosaics and churches, of Byzantine-influenced architecture, and wide canals threading through marshland. The air smells of salt water and river mud. The Adriatic coast is close enough that on certain mornings, if the wind is right, you can taste it. The streets are not ruined. The buildings are not on fire. There are no bodies in the forum, no smoke rising from burning temples. The collapse of a civilization, it turns out, does not always announce itself with pyrotechnics. For Romulus Augustulus, the morning begins in the imperial palace, a complex of buildings that, even in decline, would have been staggering by any standard outside of Rome itself. Marble floors, frescoed walls, a private chapel already being outfitted in the Eastern Christian style that the aristocracy had adopted with genuine enthusiasm. Servants move quietly. Lamps burn low oil. The boy emperor, according to what little record we have, was described even by his enemies as remarkably good-looking, handsome enough that Odoacer's men, who might reasonably have been expected to treat him with contempt, instead treated him with something closer to awkward pity. Being pretty has saved exactly one Roman emperor in recorded history. As it turned out, Romulus Augustulus was the one. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In those final morning hours, Romulus was almost certainly not alone. He had advisors, what remained of them, courtiers who had nowhere else to go, possibly a tutor or two, men who had been brought into the palace to educate the emperor's son in rhetoric, philosophy, and the administration of an empire that was, at that very moment, ceasing to exist around them. Imagine being the rhetoric teacher. Imagine trying to explain the proper structure of a formal address while an armed Gothic army positions itself at the city gates. The bureaucratic machinery of Rome, and this is one of the most genuinely fascinating things about the late empire, kept functioning even as the political reality dissolved. Scribes continued to copy documents. Tax records were still being updated. Officials still carried their official titles, still wore their official insignia, still referred to each other by ranks and honorifics that stretched back centuries. The Roman Empire was, among other things, the most sophisticated administrative apparatus the ancient world had ever produced, and that apparatus had a kind of inertia that outlasted even the empire's willingness to fight for itself. So, on that final morning, somewhere in Ravenna, clerks were probably still at their desks. Probably. Meanwhile, Odoacer was not a man who enjoyed unnecessary drama. Contemporary sources, and admittedly, they are limited and often contradictory, describe him as practical, calculating, and notably uninterested in the theatrical cruelties that punctuated so much late Roman political life. He was not, by the standards of the era, a monster. He was a professional, and professionals, when they win, prefer to win cleanly. His approach to Ravenna would have been deliberate. His forces surrounded the city not in a siege, because a siege takes time and resources, and Odoacer had already demonstrated he had neither the patience nor the need for prolonged operations. He simply made it unmistakably clear that resistance was pointless. The remaining imperial guards, whatever garrison still nominally protected the palace, understood the situation with the clarity that only comes from being massively outnumbered and unsupported. There is a specific kind of fear that settles over an institution the moment it realizes that the authority it derives its power from no longer exists. It's not the sharp fear of immediate violence. It's something slower and stranger, the realization that the entire structure of meaning you operated within has quietly dissolved, and the rules you were following no longer apply to anything real. The imperial guards that morning were not just soldiers facing a superior enemy. They were men suddenly holding swords in the name of a concept that had stopped being real. Some of them probably set the swords down before Odoacer even knocked. Audience interaction 2. Here's something worth thinking about. When an institution loses its legitimacy faster than its infrastructure, what keeps people showing up to work? This happened in Rome in 476. Does it remind you of anything happening in the modern world? Comment below, I want to hear your take. Odoacer entered the palace with his commanders sometime in the late morning or early afternoon of September 4th. The meeting between the Gothic chieftain and the teenage emperor of Rome was, by all surviving accounts, remarkably civilized. But what Odoacer demanded in that room, and what he was willing to give in return, rewrites everything you thought you knew about how empires end. Here is the myth that most people carry about the fall of Rome, that it ended in blood and fire, that the last emperor died on a sword, that civilization itself was extinguished in a single cataclysmic moment of barbarian fury. Here is what actually happened. Odoacer walked into the throne room of the Western Roman Empire and asked Romulus Augustulus, politely, by all accounts, to step down. That's it. That's the scene. No torture, no execution order, no degrading public humiliation. The man who ended a civilization that had existed for over 1,000 years in one form or another simply asked a teenager to take off the purple. And the teenager, with what must have been a combination of relief and terror, and the numb exhaustion of someone who never wanted any of this, agreed. The document that Odoacer then sent to Constantinople to Zeno, the Eastern Roman emperor, who was the last man who could theoretically claim authority over what had just happened, is one of the most remarkable pieces of political writing to survive from antiquity. Odoacer wrote, in careful bureaucratic Latin, that the Western Empire no longer needed a separate emperor, that Zeno's authority alone was sufficient, that the West was content to be governed as a kingdom under Zeno's nominal suzerainty. What he did not say, but what everyone reading the letter certainly understood, was that the Western Empire was finished, and that he, Odoacer, intended to run Italy himself under whatever title Zeno was willing to grant him. Zeno's reaction to this letter was, depending on your perspective, either the ultimate imperial calculation or the most dignified surrender in diplomatic history. He did not send troops. He did not declare Odoacer a usurper. He eventually recognized him grudgingly, after considerable back and forth, as a kind of patrician governing Italy on behalf of the East. It was a legal fiction so transparent that everyone involved certainly knew it was a fiction. Rome had two choices: pretend the arrangement was legitimate, or admit that the Western Empire was simply gone. Rome chose to pretend. It was a very Roman solution. Now, back to Romulus. Because here is where the story takes a turn that genuine historians find almost poignant. Odoacer let him live. Not just live, he gave him a pension. A real one. Odoacer sent the boy to Castellum Lucullanum, a luxury villa fortress on the promontory of Cape Misenum, on the Bay of Naples. This was not a dungeon. This was not a prison in any meaningful sense. Castellum Lucullanum had been, in better days, associated with the name of Lucullus, the famously wealthy Roman general of the 1st century BC, who had introduced cherry trees to Europe after his campaigns in Pontus, and whose name became synonymous with opulent dining. Whether the villa truly traced its origins to him, or simply borrowed the prestige of his name, is a question historians still debate, but the place itself was, by the standards of the 5th century, genuinely beautiful. Sweeping views of the Bay of Naples, sea breezes, stone walls thick enough to provide security without feeling like a cell. Odoacer assigned Romulus an annual allowance of 6,000 solidi, a gold coin that remained one of the most stable currencies in the ancient world. To put that in perspective, a late Roman foot soldier in the 5th century earned somewhere in the range of 15 to 20 solidi per year in base pay, before rations and equipment were factored in. Romulus Augustulus, the deposed emperor, was receiving the equivalent of 300 soldiers' annual wages for doing nothing, for existing quietly and not causing problems. Why? Why would Odoacer, a hardened military commander who had just overthrown an empire, show this kind of generosity to a potential focal point for future rebellion? The answer reveals something crucial about how power actually functions, as opposed to how we imagine it does. Romulus was not a threat. He was never a threat. He was a figurehead installed by his father, a boy with no military command, no political network, no personal followers, no faction that would rally to his cause. Killing him would accomplish nothing except making Odoacer look petty and cruel, which was exactly the kind of reputation a new ruler trying to establish legitimacy did not need. Keeping him alive, comfortable, and quietly grateful cost very little and earned Odoacer a reputation for measured clemency that was actually quite valuable in the political culture of the era. There is also the fact, noted by more than one historian, that Romulus Augustulus was genuinely young and genuinely handsome, and that Odoacer and his soldiers seem to have felt something resembling what the classical world called pity for the very young brought low by forces beyond their control. A sentiment Roman writers would have recognized, even if no surviving source records Odoacer's exact reasoning. What we know is the outcome. A 16-year-old boy walked away from this encounter, alive and provided for. Practical mercy. Welcome to the end of Rome. Audience Interaction 3. Odoacer's decision to spare Romulus and grant him a comfortable exile is one of the most debated choices of late antiquity. Do you think it was genuine mercy, cold political calculation, or something in between? This is genuinely one of my favorite historical debates. Let me know where you stand in the comments. Romulus was escorted out of Ravenna likely the same day, possibly the next, and began his journey south toward the Bay of Naples. He would have traveled roads built by Roman engineers, through towns administered by Roman law, past temples dedicated to Roman gods. Every mile of his journey was a monument to the civilization he had just, technically, unruled. But what happened to all the people who had built their entire lives around the idea that Rome was eternal? That is the question that haunts everything that comes next. This is the part of the story where the myth of Rome's fall becomes genuinely complicated, and where the educational stakes get very real. Because here is what September 5th, 476 AD looked like in most of the Western Roman Empire, exactly like September 4th. The farmers in Gaul were still farming. The merchants in Hispania were still trading. The bishops in North Africa were still conducting mass. The craftsmen in Britain, well, Britain had already been largely abandoned by Rome, for nearly 7 decades at this point, since roughly 410 AD, so the craftsmen in Britain were doing what they'd been doing for decades, which was figuring things out without Rome, with varying degrees of success. But for most of the former empire's civilian population, the news that a teenage emperor had handed a seal to a Germanic chieftain in a palace in Ravenna registered roughly the way that most political transitions register for ordinary people, abstractly, distantly, and with considerably less drama than the political class imagined. The Roman Empire didn't vanish overnight. It transformed, and the transformation had been happening for so long that the official ending in 476 was, in many ways, just the paperwork catching up to reality. What actually changed on September 4th, 476 AD was not daily life for most people. What changed was the idea that there was a single Roman authority, a single center of imperial power in the West, a single man who could claim the title of Augustus and have that title mean something in Milan, Carthage, Lyon, and Seville simultaneously. That idea ended. And the ending of an idea, especially an idea that had organized an entire civilization's self-understanding for over 5 centuries, carries consequences that unfold over decades and centuries, not days. The Catholic Church, which had grown into one of the most sophisticated institutional structures in the Western world, barely paused. Pope Simplicius was the sitting pope on September 4th, 476. He died in 483. Having navigated the transition from Roman imperial governance to Odoacer's kingdom with the kind of institutional flexibility that the Church would demonstrate repeatedly over the following 15 centuries. The Church had been building its own parallel administrative structure: dioceses, bishops, councils, a hierarchy of authority rooted in spiritual legitimacy rather than military power. And that structure was, if anything, better suited to a fragmented post-imperial world than to the centralized empire. The senators, the ancient aristocratic families, who had been the social backbone of Roman civilization for centuries, mostly adapted. Many of them had already been doing business with Germanic leaders for decades. Odoacer kept the Senate functioning. He kept Roman law largely in place. He kept the administrative apparatus that collected taxes, maintained roads, and adjudicated disputes. From the perspective of a Roman aristocrat in 476, the transition was less a catastrophe than an inconvenience. Your boss had changed, but your job, your property, and your status were largely intact. That's the dry humor entry for this segment. The Roman aristocracy had survived Nero, Caligula, the Year of the 4 Emperors, and the Hunnic invasion. They were going to be fine. But here is where the genuine tragedy lives, not in the palace, not among the senators, but in the infrastructure. The roads, the aqueducts, the vast engineering projects that had connected and sustained a civilization of 60 million people. These required continuous maintenance, continuous expertise, continuous investment from a functioning central authority with the tax base to pay for it. That authority was now gone. Not immediately destroyed, not burned, just gone. The aqueduct system of Rome itself, 11 major aqueducts that delivered roughly 250 to 300 million gallons of water daily to the city at its peak, began deteriorating within decades. Not because someone decided to break it, but because the institutional knowledge and the financial resources to maintain it dispersed along with the empire. By the 6th century, sections were already failing. By the medieval period, Rome's population had collapsed from perhaps 1 million at its peak to somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 people sustained, not by engineering marvels, but by the Tiber River alone. That trajectory begins, in a real sense, on September 4th, 476. And here is the lesson that should land like a stone thrown in still water. Civilizations do not usually collapse because someone destroys them from the outside. They usually collapse because the internal systems that sustain them, the maintenance culture, the institutional investment, the collective willingness to fund the boring, unglamorous work of keeping things running quietly erode until the structure can no longer bear its own weight. The Roman Empire was not stabbed. It was neglected. Audience interaction 4. the Roman aqueduct system deteriorated, not because of invasion, but because the maintenance culture collapsed. I think about this a lot in the context of modern infrastructure: bridges, water systems, electrical grids. Are we better at this than Rome was? I'm not sure I know the answer. What do you think? Tell me in the comments. Romulus Augustulus arrived at Castellum Lucullanum sometime in the late summer or early autumn of 476. He stood on the promontory above the Bay of Naples, the same bay that had looked up at Vesuvius 4 centuries earlier when Pompeii burned and looked out over water that had been Roman since before his great-great-great-grandparents were born. What nobody expected, not Odoacer, not the senators, not the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople, was that the boy who walked away from Ravenna in 476 would still be alive more than 30 years later, and that the letter he received in his old age would prove something about the fall of Rome that no sword ever could. Romulus Augustulus did not die on September 4th, 476 AD. This fact alone should reframe everything you think you know about the fall of Rome. He lived, for a very long time, by the standards of his era. Historical records, fragmentary, imprecise, but consistent enough to be credible, suggest that Romulus was still alive at Castellum Lucullanum as late as 507 or 508 AD. That is more than 30 years after his deposition. He would have been in his mid to late 40s by that point, a man who had spent the majority of his adult life in comfortable, sunlit exile on one of the most beautiful stretches of coastline in the ancient world. There is a letter from Cassiodorus, a Roman statesman serving under the Ostrogoth king Theodoric the Great, dated to approximately 507 to 508, addressed to a man named Romulus in Castellum Lucullanum. The letter discusses the possibility of increasing his pension. It is a bureaucratic document, dry and formal, the kind of letter that Roman administrators had been writing for centuries. But between its lines, if you're willing to look, is something quietly extraordinary. The last emperor of Rome was still receiving government correspondence. The government writing to him was now an Ostrogothic kingdom. He was being treated with the kind of careful institutional courtesy that the Roman administrative tradition extended to figures of symbolic importance even long after their actual power had evaporated. The paperwork of Rome outlasted Rome itself. He was, in a strange way, still embedded in a system that traced its legitimacy back to the empire he had technically ended. Now let's talk about what those 30 years meant, and what they tell us about the nature of historical endings. The popular narrative of Rome's fall tends to treat 476 as a bright line. Before it, civilization; after it, darkness. The Dark Ages. 1,000 years of intellectual stagnation, theological obsession, and artistic regression before the Renaissance finally switched the lights back on. This narrative is satisfying, memorable, and substantially wrong. The period immediately following 476 AD in Italy was, in many ways, more stable and more prosperous than the preceding century of constant civil wars, military coups, and Germanic raids. Odoacer governed Italy competently for 17 years, maintaining Roman law, respecting Roman institutions, and providing the kind of basic security that the imperial government in its final decades had utterly failed to deliver. When Odoacer was in turn defeated and killed by Theodoric the Great of the Ostrogoths in 493 inches, a dinner meeting where Theodoric killed Odoacer personally with a sword, which, in fairness, is a more dramatic ending than Romulus got. Theodoric then governed Italy for 33 years in a manner that later historians would describe as a genuine golden age of stability and cultural flourishing. The senators kept their estates, the church kept its councils, the Latin language kept being spoken, written, argued over. Roman law kept shaping how disputes were resolved. The mosaics in Ravenna, and if you ever get the chance to see them, go immediately, because they are among the most breathtaking surviving artifacts of late antiquity, kept being commissioned, designed, and laid tile by painstaking tile. Rome didn't end. Rome changed. And the ending of its political form was not the ending of everything it had built, everything it had meant, everything it had passed forward into the future. But here is the crucial nuance, the part that history education too often skips in its rush toward clean narratives. The change was catastrophic for specific people in specific ways. The Roman poor, who had depended on the grain dole the annona, the government distribution of free grain that had fed Rome's urban poor for centuries, watched that system collapse within decades. The trade networks that had carried olive oil from Hispania, grain from North Africa, glass from Egypt, and silk from further east, across the empire frayed and contracted as centralized authority dissolved. The literacy rate, never high to begin with, dropped in regions that lost access to Roman schools. The medical knowledge, the agricultural techniques, the engineering expertise, these did not simply teleport into the medieval period. They were partially lost, partially preserved by monasteries, partially kept alive in the Eastern Empire, and, slowly, incompletely, recovered over centuries. Complexity collapses into simplicity when the institutions that sustain complexity fail. That is not a medieval European story. That is a human story. And Romulus Augustulus, growing older in his seaside villa, watching the world reorganize itself around the ruins of the thing he had briefly, involuntarily represented. He is the human face of that process. A boy who became an emperor, who became a pensioner, who became a historical footnote, who became, 15 centuries later, the answer to a trivia question about the last Roman emperor. He did not choose any of it. He survived all of it. There is something in that worth sitting with. Audience interaction 5 pre-outro. We're coming to the end of this story, and I want to genuinely ask what stayed with you from this video. Was it the way the empire had already hollowed itself out before the fall? Odoacer's surprising mercy? The fact that Romulus lived for 30 years in quiet exile? Or something else entirely? I read every single comment on this channel, and your perspectives genuinely shape how I approach these stories. Take 30 seconds and tell me what hit hardest, and if something in this video surprised you, I'd especially love to hear that. The aqueducts kept failing, the roads kept cracking, the trade routes kept contracting, the world kept going, and somewhere above the Bay of Naples, an old man who had once worn purple watched the same blue water he had stared at as a boy, and tried, perhaps, to understand what any of it had meant. On the morning of September 4th, 476, a 16-year-old boy woke up in a palace in Ravenna, and the world felt wrong. Too quiet, too still, like a held breath. He spent his last day as emperor not leading armies, not delivering orations, not making the kind of historic decisions that fill the pages of textbooks. He waited. He spoke to men who had already made their choices. He signed what needed to be signed and let go of what was already gone. And then he traveled south, to a villa above blue water, and he lived. The fall of Rome is usually told as a story of violence, of barbarian fury, of civilization overwhelmed by chaos. But the actual story of its last 24 hours is quieter, stranger, and far more instructive. Empires do not always end with the clash of armies. Sometimes they end in a room where one tired boy and one practical soldier look at each other and agree, wordlessly, that the thing between them is already over. What remains after the empire falls is not nothing. It is everything the empire built that was strong enough to outlast the empire itself. The roads, the language, the law, the church, the idea that order and justice and civilization are worth organizing a society around even when the specific organization fails. The boy who woke up afraid in Ravenna grew into an old man above the Bay of Naples, and the water that he watched from his window was the same water it had always been, indifferent to emperors, indifferent to barbarians, indifferent to the rise and fall of every human institution built on its shores. The empire was gone, the water remained, and the palace in Ravenna, where a 16-year-old had once woken to a silence that felt wrong, that palace fell quiet in a different way, the permanent way. Thank you for watching Shadows of Dynasties. If this video made you think differently about how civilizations end, or how they don't, please hit the subscribe button and share it with someone who loves history. New episodes drop every week, and there are stories ahead that will genuinely shake what you think you know. I'll see you in the next shadow.